I would just like to add a note, and that is, notice in the home industry that's not expanding, it's handicapped further by the degree to which wages are not falling, in that it could be employing more of the labour that's not transferring to the new industry, can't transfer to the new industry, just stays unemployed, if the wages were falling. In other words, its labour supply and therefore output is therefore being affected, which is, of course, the cost of unemployed people. They're not being used in production. Their wage that they can't get, in fact, as it was, is still too high. Is it too high to employ them? In as far as the other costs of resources that are being diverted to the new industry have risen, and the non-export home industry is contracting. In other words, it's contracting more than it would if the wage rate were falling, and if these people that are not readily transferable to the other industry were being employed at a lower wage rate than they would have had previously. In other words, the home industry is contracting in response to the changes going on more than is necessary. Another example would have been the Thatcherite era when, well, and it wasn't just then, but North Sea oil was suddenly profitable because the cartel had jacked up the international price, and resources shifted into drilling for oil. But of course the complication was that didn't really need much labour and different skills in some measure. So as the home industry got choked off with the rising, strengthening exchange rate and all this oil being sold, of course, as well. I mean, we were just a total oil importer before, and by the end of the period, we were producing as much oil as we were exporting, and we were exporting a lot and importing a different sort, and so on and so forth. There were complications like that, but the major complication was that, well, unfortunate outcome, you could say, to say the least. It's staggering unemployment in our basic industries that were going into decline because we couldn't compete on the world market given our exchange rate for such goods. And the labour, well, couldn't move into the new industry. It wasn't wanted in large measure, and a different part of the country as well, and all the rest of it. So the revenue to the country, well, to the government anyway, for the selling of oil rights was probably more than offset by the ongoing unemployment bill that they paid. And the country was, in a sense, no better off. Great hardship. Money to be made in oil exploration, but possibly went to the foreigner if you sold the rights abroad anyway. A lot of things you have to take into account in economics, and uncertainty is legion. It really is, in trying to judge what will happen in a situation. All we can say is we've got some idea usually as to how it could be made easier, better, more fluid, or less fluid if you don't want, violent change. And in some sense you can trade off short-run gain against long-run there's a trade-off, isn't there? You can rush in and have a great deal of dislocation and social unrest, of course, unhappiness. Or you could slow things down, or you could adjust the flow in some way by adjusting taxes and benefits and capital flows and interest rates and so on. It's quite complex in the real world, to say the least. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. In the Trump case, now, present era, well, China's cornered the world manufacturing in large measure, and other developed countries are suffering from their industries not being able to compete, given a manipulation of exchange rates that keep, in effect, China extremely undervalued currency. And you've got unemployed resources in the States and Europe as a consequence. And it wouldn't be the case if all players kept the rules and didn't undercut in the way that China has, majorly, other nations by manipulating the exchange rate, keeping it low. So you can understand what the trade war's about from this perspective rather better. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. Notice, for instance, that if China sells, as it is doing, its assets, this lowers the US exchange rate, which is counterproductive from the Chinese point of view, because it makes American goods more attractive. So what you expect to be a decline in the American economy, because you're driving world interest rates up, or in particular driving US interest rates up, is at least to some extent being offset by the depressing effect it has on the exchange rate, increasing demand for American goods. Interesting. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. But to the point, what's the level of suffering in China in consequence of this war? When all's said and done, it's always the man in the street that carries the cost. Wow. Hopefully you're critical of these recordings, and I would suggest my recording of 0008 in this regard at this point. Thank you, Heavenly Dad. So we see there's the issue of wealth holding. How are people storing their wealth value? In the case of China, is it using its great trade surplus to revalue its currency? No. It's restricting the currency market. It's being government controlled instead of leaving it to supply and demand. And the surplus, well, interestingly, much of the surplus could account for such goods and services as are needed to build up a very strong military force. In a sense, without taxing the people to do it, except that they're working for extremely low wages, and that's how you're able to export so competitively in the world. Truth of the matter is that it's the bulk of the population that pays the cost of all these ventures. From the US point of view, of course, the deficit's funding the enemy's, potential enemy's, military force. I wonder what they're going to do with it. Do they really love us? I'm not sure. I don't think so. Supposing they were holding big balances of this surplus in American dollars, just hanging on to it. Oh, that's tricky. What happens if America devalues? It might, in a sort of trade war, instead of tariffs. Perhaps we'd better unload our not just dollar assets, but including dollar currency. Does dumping this on the rest of the world affect the United States? Oh yes, I think it might. Drives their exchange rate down. Well, that's counterproductive, isn't it? Oh yes, that's right, we've covered that. I mean, counterproductive from China's point of view. Might seem not in America's interest from the US point of view, but well, lowering the exchange rate makes your goods and services more attractive abroad. No doubt China will respond by lowering theirs further, and so on, and so it goes on. It can be a great handicap if the world is using your currency as a store of value, because anything can happen in the markets, and you suddenly find people are unloading your currency, and your exchange rate, if it's floating, starts to drop quite dramatically. Do you want the consequence that that has on your economy? If you've got unemployment, well, that might be good news. If you've got full employment, that might be massive inflation. Oh dear, that could be unpopular. But even the good news, you see, means, as we've seen, massive expansion in especially export type industries, taking resources from the other industries, dislocation, unemployment, especially if the wage is not flexible downwards, of course. Not at all flexible. Oh dear. Resources not transferring and not being used, and you've got to pay benefits unless you want rioting in the street, and so on and so on. Not a good idea being an international currency that's being used as a store of value. Anyone's currency could be being used like this. You know, it might be marks or whatever. You know, German, well, not German marks now, is it? Does anyone hold euros as a store of value? Oh, they might do, I suppose. Yeah.